He threw a struggling mother and her two kids out of their home, just to make room for his growing luxury car collection. It seemed like a cold, calculated decision at the time, but little did he know, his greed was about to come back and destroy everything he held dear.
Mr. Collins was known in the neighborhood for two things: his towering estate overlooking the city and his insatiable hunger for wealth. His tenants? They were nothing more than numbers on a spreadsheet. For years, he raised rents without warning, neglected basic repairs, and evicted anyone who couldn't keep up with his ever-increasing demands. But for Maria Sanchez, the mother of two, this wasn't just a financial issue. It was her family's entire world. She'd lived in apartment 3C for 8 years, holding on to every dollar to keep a roof over her kids' heads. Her son, Danny, even called the tiny living room his castle, spending hours playing pretend, unaware of the growing cracks in the walls or the overdue notices piling up in the mailbox. One fateful morning, Maria opened the door to find a letter pinned to it. Eviction notice, 30 days. Her heart sank. Despite being just 2 months behind on rent, Mr. Collins had decided to sell the building for a parking lot expansion. No negotiation, no mercy. Collins didn't think twice about the lives he was uprooting. He was too busy admiring his latest purchase, a rare vintage convertible that needed a spot in his already cramped garage. But what started as another heartless eviction soon spiraled into a chain of events that would expose Collins to the world and cost him everything. Maria sat on the edge of the bed in her cramped apartment, staring at the eviction notice crumpled in her hands. The deadline loomed over her like a dark cloud, each passing day a reminder that her time was running out. With no savings to fall back on and nowhere to turn, she began a desperate search for a new home. Every morning, Maria woke up before dawn to scour listings, visit shelters, and apply for housing assistance. The shelters were overbooked, and affordable housing seemed like a distant dream. Most landlords turned her away without a second glance, citing her financial instability and the short notice. Even charities that offered temporary aid couldn't provide the immediate solution she needed. Maria found herself spending hours in waiting rooms, filling out forms that seemed to lead nowhere. Her stress began to show. She lost weight, her once steady hands now trembling as she sipped her coffee. The sleepless nights left her with dark circles under her eyes. The pressure to keep her family safe and housed was a weight she carried alone, and it was starting to crush her. Despite her efforts, rejection after rejection eroded her hope, leaving her feeling like she was running out of time and options. At home, Danny, her 6-year-old son, didn't understand the gravity of their situation. To him, their tiny apartment was a magical place he called the castle. His innocence made the reality even harder for Maria to bear. "When are we going back to the castle, Mommy?" he asked one evening, holding his toy knight in one hand. Maria forced a smile, blinking back tears. "Soon, sweetheart," she said, her voice cracking. Her daughter Emma was older and starting to grasp the truth. She watched her mother silently, her worry manifesting in quiet questions and hugs that lingered a little longer. Meanwhile, Mr. Collins, the landlord, was far removed from the struggles of the Sanchez family. To him, the building was nothing more than an investment, a piece of property on paper. He spent his days supervising construction crews as they tore down parts of the apartment complex to make room for his new parking lot. His latest acquisition, a sleek vintage convertible, had arrived earlier that week. He proudly showed it off to his friends, who marveled at its polished chrome and impeccable leather seats. When one of his friends mentioned the eviction protest brewing online, Collins waved it off. "People always complain," he said, brushing invisible dust off the hood of the car. "They just don't understand business." The group laughed and clinked glasses of expensive champagne, their world miles away from the hardship unfolding just beyond the property line. Maria, desperate for a lifeline, decided to write Collins a heartfelt letter. She poured her soul into it, explaining her circumstances and pleading for more time. She even included drawings Danny had made of their castle, hoping they would soften his heart. When she dropped the envelope off at his office, her hands shook with a mix of hope and fear. Collins received the letter a day later. He skimmed it quickly, his expression hardening as he reached the end. Business is business, he muttered to himself before tossing it into the trash. To him, the emotional appeal was irrelevant. His focus was on expanding his parking lot and securing a deal with a luxury car dealership interested in leasing the new spaces. For Maria, the silence from Collins was devastating. Each passing day without a response felt like another door slamming shut. Her children's laughter, once her source of strength, now felt like a cruel reminder of what she stood to lose. The divide between their worlds could not have been greater. While Maria fought to protect her family from the brink of homelessness, Collins remained indifferent, blinded by his pursuit of wealth. For him, their suffering was invisible, a mere consequence of his ambition. For Maria, it was everything. Maria sat at her small dining table late one night, surrounded by crumpled drafts of letters she couldn't bring herself to send. Each one felt inadequate, failing to convey the depth of her desperation. Finally, with her children asleep in the next room, she took a deep breath and began again. Her words poured onto the page, raw and full of emotion. She wrote about the memories tied to the apartment, the birthday parties, the Christmas mornings, the times she and the kids huddled together during thunderstorms. She described the heartbreak of uprooting her children and the hopelessness she felt as every door seemed to close in her face. She explained her plan, asking for just one more month to secure a place to live. Maria wasn't asking for charity. She promised to pay as much of the rent as she could scrape together. To make her plea even more personal, she included 2 crayon drawings her son, Danny, had made. In them, the apartment was transformed into a castle, complete with turrets and a garden filled with stick-figure knights. She hoped these drawings would remind Mr. Collins of the humanity behind the cold business transaction. With trembling hands, she sealed the envelope and delivered it to his office the next morning. It was a long shot, but it was all she had left. For the next few days, Maria checked her phone constantly, hoping for any sign of compassion or understanding. But the call never came. When Mr. Collins finally saw the letter, he barely glanced at it. His secretary had placed it on top of a stack of documents requiring his attention, but to him it wasn't worth the time. He skimmed the neatly written paragraphs, his face void of any emotion. The attached drawings earned no more than a raised eyebrow before he tossed them aside with the letter. Business is business, he muttered to himself, signing another set of papers authorizing the construction of the parking lot. In his mind, Maria's plea was irrelevant. Her problems weren't his responsibility. His focus remained on the bottom line, and a few sentimental words weren't about to change that. When days passed without a response, Maria realized her last hope had been extinguished. Devastated, she confided in a close friend who urged her to share her story online. Hesitant at first, Maria eventually agreed, posting a heartfelt message about her eviction, the struggles she faced, and the indifference of her landlord. She included photos of Danny's drawings, hoping they might touch someone's heart. The post quickly gained traction, shared thousands of times within a few days. Comments flooded in, some offering words of support and others expressing outrage at Collins' actions. Local activists took notice and organized a protest outside the apartment building, demanding justice for Maria and other tenants who had suffered similar fates. Collins was furious when the protests began disrupting construction. His phone rang incessantly with calls from reporters, and his inbox overflowed with angry messages. Determined to control the narrative, he released a statement doubling down on his decision. He referred to the protesters as entitled complainers who didn't understand the complexities of running a business. But his attempts to defend himself only fanned the flames. Videos of him dismissing the protesters as uninformed freeloaders went viral, further tarnishing his reputation. Customers began canceling their leases in his other properties, and local businesses hesitated to associate with him. Still, Collins refused to back down. He instructed his security team to remove protesters from the premises and threatened legal action against anyone who disrupted his plans. His stubbornness only made things worse, solidifying his image as a cold, greedy landlord indifferent to the plight of his tenants. Maria, meanwhile, was overwhelmed by the outpouring of support from strangers. Offers of temporary housing, financial assistance, and even legal aid began to trickle in. But as much as the public rallied around her, the reality of her situation hadn't changed. Her deadline to leave the apartment was days away, and Collins remained unmoved. The turning point had come and gone, and the battle lines were drawn. On one side stood Maria and the growing community of supporters who saw her as a symbol of resilience and injustice. On the other was Collins, clinging to his wealth and pride, unwilling to see the humanity he had trampled in his pursuit of profit. As the final eviction date loomed, Maria had no choice but to pack up her children and leave the only home they'd ever known. Her belongings were stuffed into garbage bags and a few worn-out suitcases. Each item she packed felt like a painful reminder of the life they were leaving behind. Danny clung to his favorite stuffed animal, confused and tearful, while his younger sister sobbed quietly, asking, "Why can't we stay, Mommy?" Maria didn't have an answer. With nowhere else to go, Maria moved her family into a rundown motel on the outskirts of town. The room was cramped with peeling wallpaper, a musty smell, and a flickering overhead light. The kids tried to make the best of it, but their spirits were visibly broken. Danny's once vivid imagination seemed to fade as he stopped talking about castles and knights. Maria felt the weight of their despair crushing her, but she couldn't let herself break down. She needed to be strong for them. The stress of their situation, however, began taking its toll. Maria struggled to juggle her job with the demands of finding stable housing and caring for her children in such an unstable environment. Her boss, initially sympathetic, grew impatient as her performance declined. She started arriving late or missing shifts entirely because of the chaos in her life. Eventually, the inevitable happened. Maria was let go. Losing her job was the final blow, plunging the family further into financial ruin. Meanwhile, the protests against Collins had grown louder and more persistent. News outlets picked up Maria's story, and investigative reporters began digging into Collins' business practices. What they uncovered painted a damning picture. Collins wasn't just a greedy landlord. He had a history of exploiting vulnerable tenants, hiking up rents, and using unethical tactics to force people out when they couldn't keep up with payments. The backlash was swift. As public outrage mounted, Collins' business partners began distancing themselves from him. Deals he had been negotiating for months fell apart, and clients canceled their contracts. The local council got involved, issuing fines for the illegal renovations he'd undertaken to expand the parking lot. Inspectors found numerous code violations, forcing him to halt construction altogether. Collins' reputation, once built on his image as a savvy businessman, was now in tatters. Protesters gathered outside his office daily, chanting slogans and holding signs that read, "Homes over profits," and "Stop the greed." His name became synonymous with heartlessness, and his properties began to empty as tenants left, unwilling to support someone so openly vilified. For the first time in his life, Collins began to feel the sting of failure. His convertible sat unused in the garage, a mocking reminder of the wealth and success he once flaunted. His wealthy friends stopped calling, unwilling to be associated with the scandal. Even his most loyal allies in the business world turned their backs on him, seeing him as a liability. Despite his crumbling empire, Collins refused to admit fault. "This is just a smear campaign," he told himself, dismissing the media coverage as exaggerated. But deep down, the cracks in his arrogance began to show. Late at night, in the silence of his once bustling office, he couldn't escape the images of Maria's children clutching their crayon drawings. Maria, on the other hand, was struggling just to keep her family afloat. The small acts of kindness from strangers, donated groceries, offers of babysitting, were all that kept them going. But every day was a battle, and Maria couldn't help but feel like she was losing. As her family sat in the dimly lit motel room one evening, eating instant noodles from styrofoam cups, Danny asked, "Mommy, when will we go back to the castle?" Tears welled up in Maria's eyes, but she forced a smile. "Someday, sweetheart," she said, though she wasn't sure she believed it. The choices made by two people, one out of greed, the other out of desperation, had led to a tragic outcome. Maria had lost her home, her job, and her sense of security. Collins had lost his reputation, his fortune, and the respect of his peers. Both were left with the weight of their decisions, but only one had ever tried to do the right thing. Despite the outpouring of public support and protests against Collins, Maria's situation only worsened. The kindness of strangers, while deeply appreciated, wasn't enough to pull her family out of the depths of despair. They had no permanent place to call home, and Maria couldn't provide her children with the stability they needed. The motel room, once a temporary solution, became a constant reminder of her failure to protect her family. Each day, she woke up exhausted from the emotional and physical toll of the past few months. Her once vibrant hope began to fade, replaced by the weight of constant worry. The emotional strain was overwhelming. Maria found herself falling into a deep depression. She could no longer muster the energy to fight for her children's future. The financial instability had drained her strength. As the weeks passed, she stopped trying to apply for new jobs, feeling like she had exhausted every possibility. Her eyes became hollow, her spirit defeated. She no longer had the drive to face the world with the same determination that had once kept her going. Her children began to notice the change. Danny, once so full of hope and questions about returning to their castle, now asked fewer questions. He had stopped drawing pictures of knights and castles, instead opting to draw pictures of broken houses and dark skies. Maria's heart broke as she watched her children's innocence slip away with each passing day. Unable to bear the weight of the situation any longer, Maria made the difficult decision to return to her distant hometown. It was a place she had left behind years ago in search of a better life. But now it seemed like the only place she could afford to start over, even if it meant giving up everything she had worked so hard to build. With a heavy heart, Maria packed up her family's meager belongings and left the motel, knowing this was likely the end of the life she had dreamed for them. They moved into a small, modest apartment in her hometown, a far cry from the life they had left behind. The neighbors were kind, but the shame and guilt Maria carried with her made it hard for her to feel any sense of relief. She had tried so hard, but in the end, the world felt like it had turned its back on her. Meanwhile, Colin's fall from grace continued at an even faster pace. The lawsuits against him piled up, each one a reminder of his greed and callous disregard for the people who had trusted him. The bad press refused to die down. Every day, more and more people learned about his unethical actions. His former wealth seemed like a distant memory as the mounting legal fees drained his accounts. His business partners, once loyal, severed ties with him as his reputation crumbled. He could no longer afford the luxurious lifestyle he had once enjoyed. The mansion he had flaunted to his friends was sold to pay off the growing debt. The luxury cars, symbols of his success, were auctioned off to cover the costs. Slowly but surely, Collins watched as his empire dissolved, and he was left with nothing but his crumbling reputation. One evening, after all his assets were gone, Collins sat alone in his now empty mansion, staring at the walls that once represented his success. In the midst of his financial ruin, he went into his office and began sifting through old paperwork, hoping to find something, anything that could distract him from his reality. As he went through the pile of papers, his hand froze as he came across a familiar envelope, Maria's letter, the same one she had written in desperation, begging for just one more month to find a place for her children. He opened it, reading her words once more. Along with the letter were the kids' drawings, pictures of their castle, their home, their safety. A cold chill ran down Colin's spine as he realized the magnitude of what he had done. He had destroyed a family's life for the sake of greed, and in doing so, he had lost everything that truly mattered. The realization hit him like a slap in the face. He had let his desire for wealth blind him to the humanity of the situation. He sat in silence, staring at the drawings of the children who had once looked up to him as their landlord, unaware of the devastation he had caused. Now, as he looked at the paper in his hands, he understood the true cost of his actions. But it was too late. Maria was gone, and so was the family he had thoughtlessly evicted. All he had left were his mistakes, and the regret would haunt him for the rest of his life. The story of Maria and Colin serves as a powerful reminder of the destructive nature of greed and the consequences it can have on both the victims and those who perpetrate harm. The moral of the story is simple but profound. Greed blinds us to the humanity of others. By the time we realize what we've lost, it's often too late. Throughout the narrative, we see Collins, a man who once held power and wealth, dismissing the humanity of the people around him. To him, Maria was just another tenant, and her family just another source of revenue. His focus on expanding his business and maintaining his lavish lifestyle led him to make decisions that irreparably harmed others. His disregard for the struggle and dignity of the poor family he evicted seemed justified in his mind by his belief that wealth and success were the ultimate goals in life. But as the story unfolds, we see the price of his actions, the crumbling of his empire, the loss of his wealth, and the realization that his greed had come at the expense of his own humanity. On the other side, Maria's story is a stark illustration of the human cost of such decisions. A mother fighting tooth and nail to protect her children ultimately pays the price for someone else's selfishness. She is left homeless, her family torn apart, and her dreams shattered, all because one man valued profit over people. Her struggle and eventual defeat show the tragic reality of what happens when the vulnerable are disregarded in the pursuit of wealth. The ultimate lesson here is that wealth built on the suffering and sacrifice of others is never truly secure. It might seem like a victory in the short term, but the emotional, ethical, and social consequences will eventually catch up. Collins learned this too late. His material success could never compensate for the damage he had caused. Maria, in contrast, may have lost everything, but in the end she found her way back to her roots, albeit with a heavy heart and a shattered sense of hope. The story ends with a poignant reminder. Wealth may bring comfort, but it can never fill the void created by guilt, regret, and the destruction of others' lives. In the pursuit of success, we must never forget the importance of empathy, kindness, and recognizing the humanity in everyone we encounter. For in the end, it is not the riches we accumulate that define us, but the way we treat others along the way.